Okay, welcome to the second lecture of today's series of lectures, I'm really pleased to introduce Charles Djordjevic, who will give a lecture called Recognizing Expressions of Pain, Honneth, Wittgenstein, and Normative Underpinnings of the Social World. Charles Djordjevic is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the University of Zurich Institute for Theoretical Philosophy. Together with Katrin Herfeld, he is working in exploring the nature of explication and how it might relate to the social sciences, as well as how knowledge or concepts can be transferred from one field to another. Before working with her, he earned and defended his PhD dissertation, summa cum laude, before the University of Zurich's Institute for Theoretical Philosophy. He has also worked with Hans Johann Glock and Paul Horowitz, and he's trying to publish his dissertation soon. His primary research interests include the philosophy of social sciences, metaphilosophy, the history of analytic philosophy, especially Wittgenstein, philosophical accounts of representations in both natural sciences and the humanities, the intersection between philosophy and other disciplines like theoretical physics and literary theory. I will read also a couple of his most recent publications, which are really sound interesting. So, Who Guards the Guardians? Kant, Hamann, and the Violence of the Public, which is forthcoming in the Philosophical Journal of Conflict and Violence. Then also Play, Language, and Understanding in a collection of essays which will be published called Philosophies and the Play as Praxis, published in from Routledge, also forthcoming. Also most recent, A Way of Doing Meaning and Use, Hacking History and the Legacy of Later Wittgenstein in the Philosophy of Young Hacking, also will be determined, which we do publish it. So, without further ado, I will give the word to Charles.
Great. So, thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me here. It's been a phenomenal set of discussions so far. I hope my paper at least provokes some thoughts. I should let you know at the outset, anytime I'm not clear about something, or you disagree with me and think I've gone off a cliff into insanity or whatever, interrupt me, please. I'm much more interested in hearing your thoughts than mine. My thoughts are very boring. I read Dead Austrians the whole day. Gets old. So, here's the name of my presentation. Recognizing Expressions of Pain, Honneth, Wittgenstein, and the Normative Underpinnings of the Social World. So let's unpack that a bit, shall we? The claim, in social ontology, the entwinement of facts and values is increasingly discussed. You start getting this, say, with Putnam's book, The Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy in 2002. You have shades of it before then. Basically, what that means is that when social sciences investigate the social world, for whatever reason, they can't be value-free or value-neutral. There are about 10 different ways to read either of those. We can go into that in Q&A. But there's something odd here. Unlike, say, physics, where it does seem as though you can give brute causal descriptions of the behavior of targeted systems, the social world doesn't work that way. However, articulating how this fusion works is complicated. Putnam is incredibly quick and cagey on this point. Most authors are. They sort of just say, well, this happens. And so we're going to try to see if we can begin to make sense of how this fusion would work. Well, I'm going to focus on pain talk. I choose pain talk for two distinct reasons. One of which is, for my sins, I tend to think very much like an empiricist. I like concrete, specific cases. Once you get your hands around that and have grasped that, then you can start to generalize. But I always want to start with something concrete and solid. And the other is, it seems like if there's any phenomena we do as people that should be purely descriptive, it's how we express our pain. Right? It seems like if there is a moment where we can simply describe the social world without evaluations, that's going to be where it is, right? So I'm picking what seems to me to be the best case for value-free social sciences. And I'm going to argue even here, forget about it, it doesn't work. I'm going to argue that making sense of pain talk requires both acknowledgement, I'm going to steal that shamelessly from Stanley Cavell, and recognition, which I'm going to steal shamelessly from Honneth, pardon me. I'm then going to reflect on how these two features can complement each other. I take this complementarity to be the heart of my discussion, right? We'll see why once we get there, but that's going to be the heart. And then we're going to briefly talk on some rather mad speculations I have, and I'm curious to see how you respond to those. Here's how we're going to get there. First, I'm going to lay out what I'm going to call this descriptive model, which coordinates between pain, this, if you like. So it used to be called sense data. Wilfred Sellers says, no sense data. So now we like to call it qualia. So this qualia, this feeling, if you like. Pain talk, ouch, ouch, and pain ascriptions. You have a pain, she has a pain, etc. We're going to look at Wittgenstein's, what I take to be devastating critique of this, Wittgenstein's souls. However, I'm going to argue that Wittgenstein falls short on 2 points. I'm going to argue that Honneth's bodies, or embodiments, little play there, can supplement this account. Then we're going to look more abstractly at how this complementarity, this sort of mutual supplementation, gives us the tools to start making sense of normativity. And then we're going to close, like I said, with some admittedly inchoate and still not worked out thoughts. Okay, so the descriptive model of pain is going to relate pain talk, and pain descriptions together in a very particular way. So to get into it, let's just consider 2 sentences that are uttered as assertions. I have a pain, I have a pin, right? So this is stolen from Lizzie Anscombe. Both sentences seem to enter into normal and deductive relationship, inferential and deductive relationships. So for example, I can infer from I have a pin, someone has a pin. Similarly, from I have a pain, I can infer someone has a pain. I can say things like, if you have a pin, you should give it to John because he needs to hang a poster. If you have a pain, you should go see the doctor because she can help you get better. This is in marked contrast to expressions like boo, where nothing seems to follow from them, at least not logically, or perhaps even things like command, close the window. It's not clear if I can do logic on that. Some people think you can. So, given this, the fact that these pain sentences, I have a pain, plays nicely in deduction, we can infer that the semantic content, the meaning of the sentence, is truth functional. In other words, for this sentence to do what it's doing, it needs to have truth conditions. All that means is what Lewis tells us here. The meaning of the sentence is something that determines the conditions under which the sentence is true or false. It's a proposition. All this means, this is because people like jargon a lot. The idea behind it, I think, is very intuitive. The meaning of a sentence obviously can't be part of the natural language because we can translate the same content into different languages, right? That's the way this story goes. So we need something that sort of unites every single token instance of a sentence in the natural language. That's just what it tells you the picture of the world is. How does the sentence present the world as being? And if you understand it, you see that picture, if you like. These are standard metaphors. We can cash them out a bit in question and answer if you'd like. So, given this, the sub-propositional elements, words, concepts, pick your poison, of both sentences should refer to various objects or properties, and the total proposition should present us the conditions that would obtain were the sentence true. Again, people like jargon. All that means is that this concept, pin, represents this thing. And when I utter, I have a pin, what happens is that word pin refers to this thing. And you sort of put the little concepts together in your head and you form a representation. And you understand the sentence because of this representation. With pain, already something's going a little weird. I've been alive for far too long, and I've never seen someone with lightning bolts coming out of their arm. But let's leave that alone for now. We'll come back to that. If that's right, our pain talk aims to describe a possible situation in the same way our pin talk describes a possible situation, right? In both cases, what I'm doing, if you like, is giving you a logical picture, and again, I can cast these metaphors out a bit if you'd like later, of a possible situation. And you understand it if you get the picture. This means that the direction of fit is word to world, and the use of pain pin talk need not have any practical consequences. In other words, when I say to you, there are 5 chairs in this room, nothing follows practically from you. When I say to you, the Belgrade Castle is beautiful, which is actually a true proposition, by the way, nothing much follows from that either, right? These are just descriptions. All I'm trying to do is give you a picture of the world. Given that there's no normative features in either of these forms of talk. All I mean by normative features, it gives you a reason to act. So if I say to you, in marked contrast to this, close the door, that's not me describing to you the way the world is. That's me requesting, ordering, commanding, begging, whatever, you to go do something to alter the world, right? Okay, so our pain talk on this model is going to be described, it's going to describe in non-evaluative terms some inner sensation, some inner object, right? This, I have a pain, that's what it refers to. Our pain ascriptions, again, when I say he has a pain, you have a pain, have non-evaluative satisfaction conditions that determine the application of pain to another person. In other words, I use pain correctly when I see Sally collapse on the floor and she turns bright red and she's screaming. She satisfies that, and so it's true for me to say she has a pain. At this level, we can know a person's in pain without any normative dimensions, right? So this is the basic picture I think that we're drawn to exactly because of that analogy between I have a pain and I have a pain. So, this seems pretty intuitive. Because philosophers have to dress everything up, it's not intuitive, but it should seem intuitive. As innocuous as this descriptive model sounds, again, when I say I have a pain, all I'm doing is describing something going on inside me and letting you know. In the same way when I say the room has 5 chairs, I'm describing the room and giving you a bit of information. Wittgenstein's going to raise several deep worries about this. And it's our applicability to our pain talk, and through this, our pain ascriptions. So, let's begin the game. An important part of the training for pin talk, say, will consist in the teachers pointing to objects, directing the child's attention to them, and at the same time uttering the word. This seems intuitive. So the question is, if concepts like that picture I showed you earlier refer to things, how do you set up that link? Well, one way to do it is I just say pen, pen, pen. And then when you pick up the pen, I say pen. And eventually you latch onto this. And if we really want to be proper analytic philosophers, we can give this a name. So we can call it penny. And then, you know, we can track that reference throughout time. Or that's the way the story goes. Let's turn to pain. How does a human being learn the meaning of the names of sensations? Here's one possibility. Words are connected with primitive natural expressions of sensations and used to take their place. A child has hurt himself and he cries. Then the adults teach him explanations and later sentences. Why would Wittgenstein think this? Why is this analogy here? With the pen, I can ostensibly demonstrate it. I can put you, if you like Saul Kripke, in the proper causal relationship with this. I can point to it. It's there. It's a public object. With this, by definition, you don't have access to this. Only I have epistemic access to this. You don't know what I feel. And it gets worse. So imagine a teacher doing just that. She's standing in front of the room, she's trying to teach her students the words for sensations, and she starts pain, pain, pain. Why is the student going to latch on to these private inner objects rather than the gesture or something else entirely? And even worse, think about how many things we use pain for. This, a headache, heartbreak. There are so many applications of this that just don't seem to play nicely with pen. One might think one might accuse Wittgenstein here of speculative learning theory, right? This is armchair psychology in the worst sense. Ludwig, if you want to make this claim, go get a lab and see how kids learn to talk about pain. I think that's unfair. And I think that's unfair because this is his way of getting you into the picture, the story he wants to tell you. So let's look at his story philosophically and drop the armchair baggage, armchair psychology baggage. So, an inner process or object stands in need of an outward criteria. That's his first move against this model. What does that mean? The way I read that is to individuate an object requires that I can re-identify it. And nothing in the object per se tells me how to re-identify it. I need external criteria of, for example, sameness. In other words, part of how, if we can talk this way, language gets a grip on the world, part of how reference is going to attach words to things, again, I don't like this way of talking, but this is the way people like to talk these days, is that I can continuously re-identify this over and over and over. So I forget it here, I come back from a cigarette, same pen. I go to dinner, come back, same pen. That's how that word links to this object. You can see this especially clearly in proper names. Nothing in this tells me that, right? There's no, wow. Sorry, there's a way to do metaphysics so it does, but bracket that. Nothing in this object tells me that. Because it's not in here, right? There's no future pen built into this that I will see in 2 days when I walk back into this room. You need something outside of it. And that's especially true for inner objects. This is the same pain. Even worse, the descriptive model depends on an inner object only I have access to. We hinted at that a moment ago. However, if I say to myself, that it is only from my own case that I know what pains means, must I not say that of other people too? And how can I generalize so irresponsibly? In other words, if the meaning of pain is partly determined by its reference to this, and almost definitionally, I'm sure someone somewhere, well, I know people have argued against this, intuitively you have a big fight to have to prove that you would have access to this. So whatever goes on in you when you do this, I don't know what it is. Maybe this makes you feel wonderful. Given that, how can I assume anything about what you're going through? And given that, how can I ascribe to you pain? How can I say you have pain? So what we see here is that my first person use of pain, I have a pain, and my third person ascription of pain, he has a pain, these come apart. And they're going to come apart even more radically, and we're going to deepen that. So we're going to deepen this difference between the first person and the third person. What gives us the feeling, or what gives us so much the idea that beings, things, can feel? In other words, and assuming the most radically reductive and scientific stance I can, which I always find very useful, it brings a lot into view. What's a human being? Human beings, basically carbon and oxygen. That's what this thing's made of. There's some nitrogen and some hydrogen in there, a couple other things. That's it. Moreover, that carbon and oxygen, completely and totally determined by the laws of chemistry, right? There's nothing going on over and above that, one might think, from this perspective. Heaps of carbon and oxygen don't feel anything. right? No one is advocating for the rights of carbon samples in a chemist's lab when they're mixed in and have a reaction. No one thinks that oxygen feels pain, right? Why do we think a subset of these heaps of carbon and oxygen do? What gives us that idea? Now, a response I often get to this is that somehow complexity matters, which I've never, to be honest, fully understood. In here is basically fat, lipids, that like to fire off electricity from time to time. Electrical signals governed by the laws of physics don't feel pain. Fat doesn't feel pain. Why should the fact that this is complex, by whatever standard you want to set for complex, have anything to do with solving the problem? So we seem to be in a really weird position here. On the one hand, clearly when someone falls and hurts herself and is screaming, our reaction is to try to help her, or at least to notice this. Why? The critical difference between persons and heaps. And this is where Wittgenstein's model is at once brilliantly suggestive and frustratingly vague. Only if what behaves like a human being can one say it has pain. My attitude towards him or her, a fellow person, is an attitude towards a soul, not of the opinion that he or she has a soul. So for the first quote, recall that Wittgenstein is always telling you he's only interested in describing. He doesn't want to offer you explanations. Whether or not that's a problem is another matter. And this seems phenomenologically right. We have a hard time knowing what it would mean to say the oxygen in this room is in pain. I have a really good idea what it would mean to say a bug is in pain. Maybe even a bacteria, right? So it seems like there's some qualitative shift here, some different sets of categories and predications gear up. And Wittgenstein's way of expressing this is to say we have the attitude of a soul. That the thing we're interacting with has a soul. So this leads to an interesting question. Oh, well, we'll get back to it. In any case, what this suggests to us is our pain talk doesn't depend on these brute sensations, but on criteria that are outward, right? So for my pain talk to get a grip on even this, I need a way to link it over and over again as the same pain. And that's not in the pain. That's something, if you like, I bring to the table. That means, this is according to Wittgenstein, but I think this is onto something. Our pain ascriptions utilize the same criteria for others like me. The way I apply pain to you, or to her, or to whomever, is exactly with these same criteria, right? As Wittgenstein says, the X, which is the sensation, divides out in language. It doesn't matter. And in both cases, we're not describing, but are acknowledging, keyword, the others in soul, as a person who, like me, can feel pain. The only way this gets off the ground is that I can't see you as a heap of carbon and oxygen. I have to acknowledge you as a person. So, this has some interesting implications. First, our pain talk doesn't describe these inner objects. It expresses our pain. Right, that's the function. When I say I'm in pain, I'm not saying to you, there are 5 chairs in the room, there's this nice object in my chest. I'm saying to you at base, normatively, for God's sakes, help me. And we can do derivative things with it after that. Our pain ascriptions don't have non-evaluative satisfaction conditions, but require acknowledgement that the other person can also express pain. Unlike other properties, redness, right, that determines that red applies properly to that. Sorry, that was loud. Our pain talk requires us, if you like, looking at the object in question in a very specific way. All of this is to say, seeing a person in pain is to already be in a normative relationship. To even get that far, to hear someone's screams as screams, to see someone withering on the ground as in pain, that's already normative. So it seems like the original intuition that we have some purely descriptive part of the social world is gone. I'm not sure. If pain is not descriptive, I'm not sure what is. Okay, but now we have a question. What does it mean to treat someone as though they have a soul, right? In other words, what is acknowledgement and how does it work? Moreover, and worse, how do we prevent it from being an imperialistic imposition? So first, Wittgenstein's very cagey, always, but on these points in particular. He plays with intuitions and moves very quickly in these passages. He doesn't give you a sense of what is going on here. He simply says, we do this. The two questions, moreover, are sadly not trivial. In fact, they're critical. So for the first, what is acknowledgement and how does it work? There is an anthropologist named Dina Das who I have a great deal of respect for. She did her field work right after the partition of India and Pakistan, and she worked with the women who were systematically raped during that partition. And what she concludes, it's an empirical claim, but I think that she has very troublingly good evidence for it, is that there was a point where the screams of those women weren't screams anymore. Those were emissions, reactions. And the women weren't people anymore. They were symbols. They were things to be defiled. So that's terrifying. We can lose this acknowledgement. This isn't automatic. Wittgenstein sometimes seems to hint that it is. The other, how do we prevent this from being imperialistic? Well, if this all turns on the other being like me, it's very easy to imagine how one could go crazy with this, right? And start imposing pain where someone says there is no pain. You get all sorts of examples from anthropology again, like initiation rites or religious ceremonies where people seem to inflict pain on themselves. And another anthropologist who makes a lot out of this rightly is Talil Assad, who goes through and talks about how these different uses of pain, self-inflicted pain, easily lend themselves to this imperialist narrative of the stupid, savage children. They can't even figure out they shouldn't do this to themselves. Honestly, it's terrifying. So let's put some body on Wittgenstein's soul. The key is a particular, as we said, the key to all this is that there's a particular sort of inherently normative relationship that needs to exist between the self and the other. However, what I'm going to try to show you is that each of these normative relationships is an instance of the genus recognition. Let's unpack that. What's recognition? So this is, I think it's Honneth's standard definition. I'd be curious if I'm wrong about that. This is the one he seems to come up with most commonly. So recognition is first, positive affirmation of subjects or group. Second, it is an act that requires a mode of comportment, i.e. an attitude realized in concrete action. Third, it represents a distinct phenomena in the social world whose primary purpose is to affirm the existence of another person or group. Right, so that's the model. That's how Honneth wants to cash out this normative relationship. Let's unpack it and see what it means. So for A, positive affirmation. It's clear that recognition requires that the other be enough like the self. Right? For me to affirm someone's virtues or her habits or what have you, there does need to be this reciprocity, this acknowledgement. However, the egoism such a view might have is mitigated by realizing that the subject's I formation takes place in stages of internalization of social responses characterized by intersubjective recognition. In other words, for me even to be able to ascribe pain to another person, for me to be able to say, he has a pain, you have pain, requires that that person and I have both undergone this process of subject formation, socialization or enculturation that guarantees a certain similarity between, guarantees is perhaps too strong, ideally engenders this recognition. And so it's not from outside. It's simply a product of how we become persons in the first place. In other words, recognizing another as enough like me to have a pain is a symmetric relation that depends on the other recognizing me as enough like her to have a pain. right? You get a nice symmetry there. And that, in turn, this means being an I that can express pain is partly constituted by the responses of others and vice versa. Interestingly, we're already seeing how this is filling in bits of Wittgenstein's picture. Wittgenstein said, recall that, you know, the child cries and then the parents come and teach it words for this behavior. Why do they do that? Well, it's because the parents recognize the child as a person, as a being that's capable of learning these expressions. We'll come back to that in a bit. For B, practical orientation. We are able to understand the meaning of particular class of linguistic propositions only if we understand the attitude which he, Cavell, who I stole from shamelessly in the last part, describes as acknowledgement. In other words, understanding someone's pain talk requires that we already acknowledge them as being like us, as a being whose use of these expressions, like our own, requires intersubjective enculturation and human-like forms of life. Right, so that's just driving this point home. I think A and B, these are meeting this worry that I'm simply imposing my pain talk on someone else. That misunderstands how we learn it. For C, the distinct attitude. It emerges in encounters between two subjects when both sides are compelled to restrict their self-seeking drive. Ego and alter ego react to each other by limiting their respective egocentric needs. In other words, recognition occurs when two agents intentionally restrict their own projects so that the other's projects, needs, etc. can be responded to. For pain, this would mean, say, being late for a meeting to help someone who's suffering, right? And I think this gets you out of the worry about misunderstanding these culturally varied uses of pain, right? So my initial reaction shouldn't be, this ceremony is inflicting massive amounts of pain on this person. This naive savage needs to be stopped before she hurts herself. Rather, my immediate response to this should be, you're an intentional agent. Why are you doing this? What function does this way of going about doing things serve for you? How can I recognize it? How can I deal with it? So, that's my case for how pain is not only normative, but how Wittgenstein and Honneth, give us a 1-2 punch to deal with this. Let's try to abstract a bit out of this case. I stress in advance, being a good empiricist, I'm always skeptical of abstractions, most especially my own. So keep your eyes on my hands, right? There's nothing up my sleeves, at least I don't think so. But if you find something up my sleeves, call me out on it. So this is a puzzling quote from Honneth, and this comes up in several essays. In competition with the Hegelian usage, there is also a Wittgensteinian interpretive perspective, according to which recognition stands for a performative reaction to how people express themselves. This is what he means by acknowledgement. I don't know why this is competitive. I find that remarkably puzzling, especially because I think we've seen that they can play so beautifully off of each other. So let's unpack this a bit and see what's going on. So to begin, recognition as Honneth understands it without acknowledgement in the sense I've been talking about faces this. The real challenge in clarifying the use of this concept, recognition, begins once we turn to the epistemic character of such affirmative behavior. Should we understand recognition as attributive or receptive? Do I see a property and then say, oh, that's a lovely shirt, you have such nice fashion sense? Or do I, if you like, impose a property? You're such a good chess player even though you've never played a game of chess. That's what he's talking about. So a receptive understanding claims that the objective existence of values must be presupposed in a way that is incompatible with what we know about the constitution of values. In other words, so if we simply perceive these things that we recognize, this makes sense if we're working within a perceptual metaphor. So I see that the folder is red, I recognize it's red. I see that your shoes are Nike, as are my own, I recognize that, etc. By contrast, once I turn to properties that Honneth is interested in, kindness, care, solidarity, pick your poison here, perhaps even pain. In fact, I think I've argued that pain would fall into this. Something's gone weird. It doesn't seem prima facie like I see kindness in the same way I see that your shoes are Nike. There are some moves one can make to get out of this. The one that I like, we'll talk about in a moment. It seems to me the one that Honneth wants to make is to pull in second nature from John McDowell, look really carefully at enculturation, and talk a lot about progress, right? Those are the things he's going to use to try to account for how we can, in some non-metaphorical sense, see the property of kindness or of helpfulness or whatever. Problem with that. This only makes sense if we assume that the being in question is capable of receiving a second nature and entering into the space of reasons. That's not trivial. So Cavell gives you this wonderful story about his daughter when she's a newborn and she's slowly growing up. And the way Cavell, you know, being a good Freudian in part, tells this story is that this newly born infant has no sense of self, is certainly not part of what McDowell calls the space of reasons, is not responding to normative pressures, is, if you like, pretty darn close to mechanically reacting to things, even to the point where they don't make sense. And yet Cavell and caregivers generally don't react to this entity that doesn't yet have a self, cannot yet reason, doesn't have concepts, doesn't have language, in the way they do to broken pipes or to old computers. They react to it as if it can have a self. So in any case, we only perceive pain in elements for which we seriously consider the possibility of their having pain. And the problem with this way of going with John McDowell and these people is they don't have a story, at least on my reading, of why we should consider children, infants, or small animals, why small? Animals generally, as having pain. So, an attributive interpretation of recognition claims that recognition would award or supplement the affected subject with something she had not had before. As I said, the problem with this is simple, and Honneth knows this and worries about it, and pretty rightly so. Our judgments might just become arbitrary. So I go to someone and I say, you fly the airplane so well. You've never flown an airplane in your life. What am I up to there? That doesn't even make sense. That doesn't have a grip on you. But I think there are cases of this attribution of recognition, what I'm going to call acknowledgement, because I think that's what this is, where this does get a grip. One of them would be, again, this example of the child in the space of reasons. We don't treat children, infants say, as broken machines that we need to fix with screwdrivers. We interact with them, we talk with them, we do our best to explain what we're doing, to explain to them what they're doing. I mean, watch how children and their caregivers interact. It's beautiful. Part of why we do that is because we are attributing to them the ability to become adults, the ability to become persons. As an aside, I wouldn't call that adult. I don't think anyone's ever an adult. That's another topic. Same with animals, dogs and ascriptions, right? It seems like I can very reasonably say the dog wants the bone. The dog's in pain. The dog believes that if it's chewed the shoe, it's going to get in trouble. These seem innocuous, and they seem to make sense of the phenomenon. Again, dogs don't seem to be in the space of reasons, at least not if we're going to follow McDowell. The last two are where I think the political aspect of this starts to come in. So think about Les Miserables, Jean Valjean and the priest gesture. So in this story, Jean Valjean, who's a convicted convict, sometimes I can speak English, is released from prison. And he goes to a priest's house, a bishop's house to be precise, and asks for sanctuary. And the bishop says, yeah, that's okay, you can stay with me, it's fine. And he steals all of this silver from the priest. And he runs out the door. And a couple hours later, the priest comes back, or the police come to the priest with Jean Valjean, who has the silver. And Jean Valjean's concocted this mad story about how the priest just gave him the silver. And the priest looks at the police and says, that's exactly what I did. How dare you drag an innocent man to me? Of course I gave him the silver. And then the priest goes and gets what's left of this silver, sticks it in his bag and says, with this I purchase your soul. What's going on there? Jean Valjean's not a good man. Jean Valjean is robbed from this priest. The priest is ascribing or attributing to Jean Valjean a property he doesn't yet have. And that ascription seems to be based, as the priest says, on faith more than anything else. And the whole point of the story is watching how that non-existent property guides Jean Valjean to manifest it, right? So this is where all sorts of stuff in metaphysics starts getting weird too. Same with Martin Luther King and the demand that the US do better, right? He saw how horrible the US was back then, and yet he ascribed to it this property that it could be a better place. So this attribution, this acknowledgement, is doing something really fundamental there. So, in sum, I think that we have a two-tier model. I think that these Honneth and Wittgenstein are complementary. So at the first stage, we have attribution, acknowledging someone as his soul, in which case we act as though they are. We comport ourselves with they. Even if they lack concepts, control, the self in the case of an infant, even if they're manifesting these negative properties in the case of Jean Valjean, we ascribe to them, independently of the behavior, that they can be people. This is based, I think, ultimately on cognitive responses, not cognitive relations, right? It's not that a parent sits down and thinks to herself, "Aho, I'll treat these noises that this carbon is producing as cries of pain," or "I'll treat this look that she's given me as a mechanical reaction." It's much more emotional. The child is scared. She wants to play, etc. Once you've got this done, once you've acknowledged someone as having a soul, once they're into this possible space of reasons, if that's the way you want to talk, recognition emergence is just specific ways to respond to the unique qualities a person displays and can take pride in. Right? Once I acknowledge you as a fellow person, as a language user, as a being with concepts and goals and all of this jazz, and I figure out that you're really proud of your tennis game, then yeah, I recognize that and I say, you play tennis very well. Or I don't know why my examples are always so terrible. There are many more examples than this. And this is interesting. I think you can start to get into objective spirit, if you like, here, because it seems like this is going to bring into play a whole host of mediating institutions that make tennis games possible, say. We can talk about that in Q&A if you like. In any case, all I've tried to argue here is we need bodies and souls. We need acknowledgement and recognition. We need Wittgenstein and Honneth. Souls are best understood in terms of our faith that, for example, a baby will grow up and enter into the space of reasons. We acknowledge that ability. Bodies are best understood as normative patterns that get encoded in relationships, and they allow us to perceive these qualities and respond to them with encouragement, recognition. So, if this presentation, and I'm sorry, I realize I've been talking for like 7 hours, and I apologize. If this presentation has been convincing, we see that most of the primitive even the most primitive biological reaction, pain, is always already normative. In turn, that should make us really skeptical of trying to link social ontology to the ontology you get out of, say, physics. That just doesn't work, I don't think. This is just summing up again because I'm long-winded. This is the one that interests me, and I'm playing with this, and I'm on very shaky ground with it. one possible and extremely speculative uptake of this is, if this is so, Honneth's quite right that normativity is baked into the social world, right? We've seen that. You only see these patterns if you have already acknowledged the person is acting intentionally and etc. However, it also seems as though part of this baking requires this acknowledgement attribution, or faith. Faith that the child grows up. Faith that Jean Valjean can be a better person. This might help make sense of what utopic thought, even in the non-scientific form, is supposed to do. Just a thought. Thanks for listening. Questions, comments, concerns, solutions are welcome. Email me at this is my personal email. So, thank you.